Welcome to the MasterYourMix podcast, helping engineers, producers, and artists create professional recordings and mixes, even from home. I'm your host, Mike and Davina. Let's get started. Hey, welcome to the Master Your Mix podcast. My name is Mike and Davina, and thanks for hanging out with me today. Today, my guest is Matt Foster. If you're not familiar with Matt, Matt is an engineer and producer originally based out of the UK. He got his start working as an assistant at EMI's Music Publishing studios in the mid-90s, where he had the opportunity to work with a lot of bigger artists such as Jamiroquai, Primal Scream, Elastica, Jazzmatazz, and a whole bunch more. And in this interview today, we get into a lot of great discussion all about his processes relating to getting big, clear, low end and what he likes to do there to, get his kick and bass and all that kind of stuff to work well together and make the low end sound big, even on small speakers. We also get into what he likes to do when it comes to getting great vocals. Matt has a great knack for getting his vocals to sound really clear and very focused. And we get into all of his process about the various types of compressors that he likes to use. He covers his go-to tools for that. We talk about dealing with sibilants and a whole bunch more. If you're someone who struggles with getting your low end to sound clear or getting your vocals to sound really polished, this episode is going to be really helpful. So with that said, let's just jump right into it. Matt Foster, thank you so much for being on the Master Your Mix podcast. How's it going, man?
Thank you. I'm really well. Thank you very much. How are you?
Doing great. For people who might not know you or aren't familiar with your work, can you give us a little bit of that background on who you are, what you do, and ultimately how you got into all this stuff?
Sure, absolutely, yeah. So I'm a mix engineer and producer, and I've also done some teaching at audio engineering colleges. And my background started off in the 90s in the London music scene, music industry, recording studios. And yeah, I was very lucky to have kicked it all off there.
Nice. So how did you ultimately get into the music production? What got you started with that?
Yeah, well, I was a musician around the age of 15, 16. I started playing guitar and really heavily getting into music. I had a group of friends, probably like most people really, I had a group of friends. We all played guitar. We went to gigs. We, were throwing ourselves into music left, right, and center. I was very much into kind of, at that age, a mixture of mostly rock music, American and English rock music. But I was also more into, or as well as that, I was into kind of hip hop and that kind of stuff of the 90s. And yeah, so I guess music was always on my radar. It was always something that I was very, very interested in. Never really considered it as a career. And I was studying at a college, doing my the traditional kind of English, history, sociology, those kind of things. And I remember there was a guy there that was like a careers guy. And he was talking about, what you wanted to do when you left college, etc. And I was I was kind of thinking about maybe being a sound engineer. And, it all kind of seemed a bit pie in the sky, kind of something that wasn't really that accessible. Didn't know much about it. And he turned me on to a college course that was in central London. And so I applied for that and I got a place. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, this makes a lot of sense, because I didn't really, and I was never into the touring with band thing. It always just seemed a bit kind of unstable to me. I'd been performing in various bands and I like local gigs, but the idea of jumping in a van and going around Europe, it didn't really appeal to me. So as an alternative thing to that, being a sound engineer based in a studio seemed like something really cool and that I could get into. And I think it was that marriage of loving music, being a musician, but also being quite technical as well, and being interesting into the engineering part and acoustics and what have you.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what prompted me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. That touring life isn't for everyone. That's for sure. It takes a certain type of personality to to be able to do that. And you also just have to be very on top of your business skills if you're going to make it work financially on the road. Like I think you need to to know how to make a lot of money.
Yeah, and absolutely, yeah. And it turns out it was right for me, because years later I started to do some live sound, and I realized that was not for me either. I kind of enjoyed it, but again, it was that the road kind of calling, and I was just like, no, it's not for me. And I was very much at that time. I'd been in and around studios for quite a while, and I really liked the sort of controlled atmosphere of a studio as opposed to the sort of chaotic live kind of scenario. Especially when you're first starting in the live area, there was bands not turning up, and equipment not working, and working in some real live venues, so it was the safety of the studio.
No, I totally agree with that too. Like in my experience doing live sound, I did a lot of touring and stuff like that, and it's just like every night is a new stressful event where it's just like, all right, how do I work in this room? Where are all the patches? Like, how do I use this board that I've never seen before? Stuff like that pops up all the time.
Yeah, completely. I had that exact experience. I did a gig one time as a live sound engineer, and I turned up, and I think it was like my third or fourth kind of gig doing live sound. So I was gradually getting into it. It was in central London. But so I rocked up to this club, and it was probably about 100, 150 capacity, and they had a few bands booked and all that kind of stuff. And I turned up, and it was the first major hurdle that I had, where there was the mixing desk was in some back cupboard, lying on its, with all the knobs facing the floor. No one knew where the cables were. No one knew where the monitors were. I think it doubled as like a comedy club or something as well. So they just shoved all the music equipment into a cupboard. So I was like, yeah, this is, I think that was the last time I ever did it, in fact.
Seems like a good time to call it quits on that kind of thing.
Good time to bail. Yeah.
When you're now becoming like the systems engineer, and you got to put together the whole system and get the show running, that's a little different than just showing up and like everything kind of being more or less.
I had friends and colleagues who were doing the live sounding, and we were still in bands, and their complexion was not a good advertisement for wanting to get into that kind of thing.
That's a good point. Yeah, you definitely have to enjoy having pale skin and never seeing daylight and
riding it
working at night all the
time. Absolutely. So respect to those live sound engineers.
Totally. There's a it's a tough gig, and there's certain people who are cut out for it, and those guys are amazing, and making it happen, guys and girls, and like they're making it happen, and we get to enjoy shows as a result of those people. So there's thank God for them, for sure, So you talked about how you went to the school, and I'm assuming that's like the primary place where you started to learn more about production. After school, like where did your career go from there? Like, obviously you said you did some live stuff, but as far as getting into studios, what was that like?
Yeah, so I was very lucky because the college course that I did was 3 years. The first year was full-time study, and in the second year, it was like a thing that we have in England or in the UK called day release. So we would do college 1 day a week, and then the rest of the week, which I assume would be like Tuesday to Friday or whatever it was music or a studio placement. So, and the college actually arranged for you to get placements in the studio. So this was super cool. And like, thinking back, how lucky was I? Because I'm not sure that kind of thing even exists anymore. It was a particular feature of the college course that I did, that they got these placements for you in the studios, and they had hookups with all these different studios, and some really good studios as well.
Nice.
You could be proactive yourself and go to a studio and say, hey, do you want me to work there? And, and do this combined studying and work kind of thing. So I completed my first year, and that was like a foundation at college. And then I remember, I think I went for an interview at Red Bus Studios first, which is kind of a famous studio. I don't think it's there anymore in London. It's to do with Red Bus Recordings, which is from a big label from the 70s. I believe they had Brian Johnson from AC/DC his band Geordie was signed to them, I believe. Anyway, so I went there and the studio just blew my mind. It was just amazing. First time I'd been in like a big studio, in inverted commas, and the big tape machines, the big consoles, the big speakers, big rooms. And I don't think I got that job there. But on the same day or very close to that time, I went for an interview at EMI Music Publishing with a fellow student of mine. And I remember being told, like, hey, look, we've got like 50 people have applied for the job. We only have 2 positions. We're interviewing like 20 people. So I was like, I'm probably not going to get it. So I went in there kind of casual, and lo and behold, I got the job. So I got a job working for, well, when I say job, it was like not an internship. They did pay, but it was pretty much just paying expenses and a little bit on top. So I was doing my one day at college, and then the rest of the week I was in the studio in my music publishing. But it was great. It was the perfect job to get you into studios, because it was for EMI Music Publishing. It was a demo studio, and it was a demo studio for their writers. So it could be the artists, it could be bands, it could be just people who concentrate on songwriting. But there was kind of no pressure. It wasn't a commercial facility. Somebody wasn't paying for the session. So it was quite relaxed. And I believe the hours were like something like 10 till 6 or 10 till 6:30, which is completely unheard of.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Maybe PM to AM, that kind of thing. That's pretty typical.
I know, right? Yeah. Well, that came later. I'll tell you more about that baptism of fire later. But so I had a job there, and it was amazing. Again, I had that same buzz going in there. It wasn't, the biggest studio, but it was way more than was really needed for a lot of those writing sessions. We had a lot of bands used to come in. Jamiroquai was signed to EMI Music Publishing. So they used to come in for writing sessions. And what was great about that was exactly as I was saying, there was no pressure. They weren't there to record the next single or the album. They were just there, given some time to, try some things out, maybe make some drum loops, listen to some records, create some samples. The main singer from Jamiroquai, Jay, was never there. But Toby, the keyboard player, Stuart Zender, the bass player, Derek McKenzie, the drummer, was there. And, and they were just kind of jamming, and they were really cool guys, and that was awesome. And then we had bands like Elastica around coming in. There was a lot of songwriters. It was really cool, because I got to be shown and learn in a kind of casual environment, what an XLR cable was, where to plug it, why you needed phantom power, how to line up tape machines, what a compressor was, how to use the patch bay, where to patch things in. So, it was really, really cool.
That's amazing. It's such an interesting thing too, because like you would almost think that at that level of musician that's coming through, or, these writers and all that a place like EMI, they would want like people who were super on top of their game and like, who really knew everything about the equipment to make like the life of the artist super easy. You know what I mean? But the fact that you got to learn while working with some of these really big artists in the room is such an interesting thing.
Yeah. Well, bear in mind, I was just an assistant. So I was, I started off literally as like a glorified runner. They did have engineers there, like, so JB, who was the chief engineer manager, and then Darren, who had my job a couple of years prior. And those guys really knew their stuff. They were really on it, especially JB, because he was, he'd been doing it for a while at that point. And he was really cool because he was a really good musician and a really good producer. And he was very much into kind of indie stuff, but he also knew his way around a sampler and lots of synthesizers that we had. So he was the kind of perfect guy to have running your sessions, so he could do anything. He could record a band. He could program for you, he was producing techno records. It was so interesting. And one of the projects that was fascinating that they did there was, Guru from Gangstar.
Yep.
Yeah, he had like a side project, which probably became as big as Gangstar, was called Jazzmatazz.
Hmm.
So he was, I think, I don't know who was making the beats, but it was kind of like hip hop beats. But he would get like people like Courtney Pine playing on there, and various other soul singers. Every track was something different. So the first Jazzmatazz project was, part of it was recorded at the studio, EMI Music Studios, or the publishing studio, and they came back to do Jazzmatazz too. So I was assisting on the sessions there. That was an insight into a real session, if you like. People coming in at certain times, having to be ready. Final recordings were being made.
Yeah.
But there was things like that going on there as well, and of course got to know the people in the music publishing department, the A&R people. Had some amazing artists signed at the time. So yeah,
Nice.
it was really cool.
I imagine that like working in a demo studio where, like you said, like these artists are sometimes just coming in with no ideas. They're coming in just experimenting and creating songs on the spot. I'm assuming that you must have observed a lot of, or learned a lot of really cool lessons about the process of songwriting or production, like just by being around people who are creating things as opposed to like coming in with ideas flushed out, right?
Yeah. So many things. I mean, just things like double tracking vocals, lead vocals. That was new to me. I hadn't even thought about it. Probably wasn't even aware. Stacking harmonies, recording vocals in a certain kind of way. And at those times, the technology was more basic. So it was synchronizing the computer to the tape machine, but yeah, as you said, like the songwriting thing, yeah, like Kathy Dennis used to be one of the writers that used to come down a lot. She worked with like Danny D, and they'd be writing for all kind of people. And yeah, you'd just be sitting in on a session and, watching them create melodies and, writing lyrics and structuring songs, So that side of it, again, was really fascinating. And the same with the band thing as well. There was a really cool artist, Gem Archer, who went on to join Oasis. He was signed to EMI Music Publishing, and he had an amazing band called Heavy Stereo, who they never really made it big, but they were just always on that kind of verge. But to be around him was amazing. Incredibly talented, creative guy. And he was always talking about like, we need to use some seventh chords and the harmonies need to be sevenths. And they were listening to like Beatles songs and, copying what the Beatles are doing, like harmony wise. And I think one of the things that probably I was quite good at was just wanting and being super keen at the same time was just diving in. So I was quite happy just to man the tape machine. So for JB, he was like the main engineer there. He even used to say to me, I'm really happy for you to do this because, I've done it so much that I can just step back. Someone mans the tape machine. I can focus on the sound, pop out, and it helped him a lot. And, it taught me a lot as well. So for those guys in Heavy Stereo and other bands, I was like, pressing the red light and learning to know, which tracks to arm on the tape machine. We had like 24 track 2-inch machines then. I believe it was an Atari MTR-90 Mark II, which was kind of a staple machine for London at that time. So yeah, it was really good. It was really good. And I think as well, thinking back now, that because we had, some big names coming in, it really kind of not only just getting to know the sort of technicalities of a studio, but, being able to deal with artists, and, at first it was probably, a bit like freaky, like, oh my God, it's like, it's Jamiroquai, they're coming here. But, after a few days, and you get to hang out with them and, you kind of become more at ease So yeah, it was the perfect entry into recording studios for me. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, that sounds amazing. Like the fact that you would get to work on so much different music, different genres, and meet people that are of all different levels of fame, and like what better environment could you possibly learn in? Like it sounds amazing. Yeah,
absolutely, it really was.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I'd love to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about some of your technical process with stuff. And one of the things that like really stands out to me when I listen to your mixes is that you do a great job of getting big low end with your tracks, but your tracks don't sound muddy. And you're also like not the kind of person who like overhypes the top end. Because I feel like that's something a lot of people do these days. They kind of have that smiley face EQ curve where you got tons of low end and tons of top end and the middle's kind of muddy and all that. But I feel like you do a really good job of just making everything feel really big and balanced. So I'm curious to know, like, in your opinion, what is the key to getting great low end?
Yeah, well, firstly, I'm really happy that you noticed that. Because that is something I've spent countless hours, days, weeks, months focusing on. And I think largely it's a mindset. I think a lot of it comes from working with or originally coming from an analog background with analog tape machines, analog consoles, and just really liking a bright and open and airy top end, but not like spiky and harsh, with tape machines, it was relatively easy to get that because they had the natural tape compression and it would round off some of that spikiness in the high end on, like overheads, hi-hats, even guitars, vocals, sibilants, that kind of thing. But also it would sort of enhance the bottom end. The reason that it came about, like me really wanting to get into low end, was I've always been a big, I say always, but for the longest time I've been a huge reggae fan, which obviously a lot about the low end.
Of course.
And in the late 90s, I happened to be working with a lot of electronic dance music. And of course, bottom end was massively important to those dance records. It took a while to really understand that, to have that super low end. Seems kind of like an obvious thing. But it was more of a case that sometimes people would come in and I would mix their records and the low end was there. Other times it just wasn't. They had the thinnest kick drums and they weren't aware of it. And if the mix engineer is not aware of it, then you're kind of in trouble. But yeah, I know what you mean about that smiley face thing, especially contemporary pop music is uber bright, super bright, and I try to match, I don't want my mixes to sound dull compared to anyone else's mixes. But I try to match that for openness. But like I say, try and get it kind of controlled and have the large bottom end at the same time. Of course, completely dependent on the song. And, it's not like a template applied to everything, but given the opportunity, yeah, I love to do that.
Yeah, for sure. So then with regards to like, I think when a lot of people think about low end, they'll typically focus on things like the kick or the bass. And obviously those are two instruments that love to fight each other for the same sort of space. Are there any tricks that you have there as far as like getting those two to work well with each other?
Yeah, well, I mean, in the electronic world, house, techno, dance, those kind of things, when you've got a bass line and a huge kick drum, obviously side chaining is quite a prominent technique. But one of the things that I do quite a lot is just side chaining the low end of a particular instrument. If you take the bass and it's being triggered to duck on the low end with a multi-band compressor, it just gives more space to the kick. And it's the kind of thing I don't really want people to hear, and I don't do it all the time. It depends. If there's this kind of rubbing with the bass and the kick drum, or I should say the bass instrument, bass synth, whatever, there's this rubbing between the kick and the bass. I've got a 12-inch subwoofer in my studio, so yeah, bass is really important to me. So sometimes I can be listening on my main monitors without the sub engaged and everything seems fine. I put the subwoofer, and there's definitely some kind of ugly kind of rumble. It's not so clean. It's not as powerful. So yeah, doing that sidechain technique of just ducking the low end, 80 hertz and below on the bass triggered from the kick, really just helps create a little bit of a kind of, more space for the kick. Doesn't even have to be that much, and I try the extremes, maybe 9, 10 dB, and then I try, maybe 1 or 2 dB, and then kind of try and find like the sweet spot where it kind of sits. But it also helps to give a bit of a groove as well, So yeah, that's one of the things I do. One of the other things is, and I've been doing it for eons, for a long time, is using Waves R bass, which is the subharmonic synthesizer thing, which adds harmonics to sounds. And what's interesting about that is that in terms of the low end, it can be surprising how little actually energy is going on in the sub frequencies. And maybe it's just the harmonics of the bass. So you can take a relatively clean bass sound and make it sound like it's a lot wider and it's a lot heavier by applying our bass. It just seems to fill the speakers a lot more. And also it has the added benefit of, or on smaller speakers that don't have so much low end capabilities, it also makes the bass seem bigger there as well. I have to say though that one of the things is just still hard work,
Of course.
rolling up the sleeves and just tweaking it until the low end, until it's, it's full. And exactly as you said, not muddy, it's full, and it makes the room vibrate, makes the speakers really powerful, but it doesn't overpower the mix. It's a kind of tasteful thing, and sometimes, I'll just really experiment, I'll make the bass crazy loud, super deep, and then maybe pull it back in and just trying to kind of find a sweet spot for where the mix kind of works. And I think particularly in kind of sort of the house mixes that I do, people really appreciate that, they really appreciate that huge chunky low end, but at the same time it's very balanced with the rest of the mix.
Of course. Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that idea of experimenting and trying lots of different things, because yeah, it's true. It's not like you just create a template and then you throw your tracks in there and the tracks hit the same level all the time and all of a sudden it works. Like sometimes you do have to go a little harder on the bass in certain songs, or a little bit harder on the compression or that kind of thing, or a little softer and that kind of thing. It's it's going to be song dependent, so you do have to be willing to experiment with stuff. And obviously, yeah, you can have your starting points that like feel good, but constantly be referencing the extremes against that baseline and see what actually sounds better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it translates to other genres as well. I remember reading an interview with Alan Moulder years ago, and he'd started off doing bands and then he'd got into doing some dance music. And he said that having that experience of learning on the job of mixing dance music translated to rock music as well. What frequencies to boost on the kick to make it sound weighty but without being muddy. Just being aware of those lower octaves of the bass end or the frequency spectrum. It really kind of translates. Of course, you still have to keep it like in context. You don't want to have crazy low end on a rock song that's there's still other attributes that you kind of need to have there. But sure. I think also as well, that was one of the things about some of the mixes that Andy Wallace was doing in the late 90s and early 2000s. The stuff that he did with like Limp Bizkit and those kind of people. He had really powerful low end, and combined with the guitars and stuff, it was, slightly unusual. Yeah. Even like Linkin Park, the low end was big, yeah. And it just made the mix sound really huge as well.
Yeah. But there's only so much low end that you have, right? So I'm glad that you also brought up that idea of using like the harmonic enhancement, because sometimes that is the way to make that low end feel bigger, but it's not really occupying low end space. It's, you're hearing Absolutely. Those harmonics to perceive it as louder, right?
Yeah. And it's something that's important to me as well. I have a little pair of speakers in my studios, some IK multimedia iLouds, and they're kind of there for that specific reason, really, is to, when I listen to them at a certain volume, I want to be able to hear the bass. They're small speakers, they don't go particularly low. But I want to be able to hear the notes of the bass, So even though it's a lot about boosting sub frequencies, there's a lot about, dialing in some low mid range, to maybe give some pluckiness to the bass, or, I always love how audible Paul McCartney's bass was in the Beatles, and it's a really important part of the Beatles, like, because he's playing these crazy bass lines, or crazy cool bass lines that have some nice inversions in them, very melodic in themselves, So
but they're not super subby either.
No,
like they're
definitely
actually
not.
much more mid range.
No, but there's that kind of pluckiness to them, that audibility, and they're not overly mid-range either. They just sit there really nice, And of course, it's not just about the instrument itself, carving some of the other stuff out. And I think that was one of the things that I learned as a mix engineer. I can't remember who I was assisting, but I was assisting a mix engineer, and a really obvious thing that he did, but at the time it was an epiphany for me, was that he had this track that had a piano. It was like a live band kind of thing: piano, live drums, live bass. It was a Rhodes, maybe some live strings and some vocals. And the intro started with this huge piano sound, like big clunky, lots of low notes. And then the drums kicked in with the bass. And he did a really simple thing. He just duplicated the piano, had separate settings for the intro and separate settings for when the drums and the bass kicked in, and just thinned out the piano a little bit when the full band kicked in. You wouldn't notice it, but if he'd have left the same settings or the same EQ that he had for the intro going into when the full band kicked in, it would have been really hard to make it work. It seems seamless when you listen to it. I was like, oh, okay. So it's not only like an arrangement thing, it's like how you treat it and the other sounds to occupy the bass, So yeah, that was an interesting lesson.
Yeah, it's a really great lesson. It's all about that contrast, right? Like I can't remember. I think it was, there was some artist I was listening to who was talking about working with a producer named Lou Giordano. I think it was the singer from the band The Ataris. I don't know if you remember them, but anyway, he was always talking about how, like, that producer, his goal was, like, when they were workshopping songs, it was always like, let's find a way to either create a pause right before the chorus hits so that everything drops out, or we find like some little part that we can thin out, and then we make the chorus hit harder, and like just like little things like that. That's arrangement, but it's also touching on the EQ perspective and finding ways to just create a contrast so that your parts differentiate themselves. And
didn't Bruce Springsteen do that on some Michael Jackson songs? I heard that he limited the bandwidth in the intro, so when the beat kicked in, it would sound bigger.
Yeah, I believe that for sure.
Yeah, I can't remember what songs it would have been, but it really opened my mind to, like, because I think at some point I was just into that thing. Oh, you have a mix and everything's kind of static. You have static settings on the EQ, the volumes to just make the song just as it is. But as a mix engineer, you're neglecting a lot of the things that you can do to not only enhance the arrangement, as you say, but, make things work better. So a lot of things that I do in the mix, is that, enhancing the arrangement. Sometimes it might be, I literally had it on mixes I've done this week. Sometimes if it's like a pop dance kind of track and in the chorus, the kick is pumping away, sounds great. But in the verses, maybe it just sounds a bit too pokey when there's less instrumentation going on and there's not so much of a dynamic. So I quite often will duplicate that kick track and for the verse have a slightly different EQ. Nothing, it's not rocket science, it's just maybe making it a little bit like duller, maybe slightly less low end, maybe slightly just low in volume, but just treating it in a different kind of way, And same for the bass, same for vocals, Very rare for me to have a lead vocal that will be on the same track from the beginning to the end. I'll normally duplicate the track and treat it different from the chorus and different for definitely for the bridge and for the middle eight. And even if I have it on a single track, I might even do a bit of automated EQ, or in Pro Tools do some EQ, just the clips itself. So yeah. And like I say, that was, and I'm still learning and developing those kind of things, but that's when mixing became really exciting for me. It was like, you can really enhance the arrangement with some of the things that you do.
For sure. No, I love that. I think that's a great lesson for people to learn if they haven't already. It's like you're always trying to make things work well in the song, and it doesn't have to be static. I remember a similar idea. Like someone once told me, like with a lot of heavy metal stuff, like whenever there's double kick parts, a lot of engineers will automate the high pass filters, so they'll just like bump it up a little bit during those sections, so you don't just get this like wall of low end mud, right? And it's because the parts are usually so fast, you don't even notice that it got thinner for a split second, and then it goes back to the groove, and it's like heavy again, and feeling full, like But it's something that like once you realize that like you can do that, it makes your mixes so much cleaner.
It's a game changer. It really is. Yeah. And being tuned into those areas where there can be problematic things. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I do similar thing as well. Like you mentioned with like the metal thing, when you've got like the double bass drum, maybe changing the compression, slowing the tack time, treating things individually for certain parts, maybe using a transient designer to add a little bit more attack, and those kind of things. Yeah, I think that alongside being open-minded to kind of like special treatment with effects can really enhance people's mixes a lot, I think.
Of course, yeah. So we obviously talked about focusing on low end, and like I was saying earlier, like you're not the type of person that usually overhypes the top end. So to me, then the mid range has to be that thing that balances out with the low end to make it feel really nice and clear still. So as far as it relates to mid range, what are some of your tricks there for making sure that you get that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, hard work takes just trial and error. Really trying to shape things in certain ways. That's the most important tool, or most important thing, I think, is just having to dive in. But something else that's come along fairly recently that helps a lot is things like the unmask module in the Isotope Neutron plugin, where you can have, let's say you've got like a super buzzy, noisy synth sound and a lead vocal, and they're conflicting. There's some, they're fighting for clarity in the mid range. The unmask module, you can send the vocal via sidechain, that module in the plugin, and it will work out the frequencies that are conflicting for you and duck them. Sometimes you can get away with a surprising amount. Other times it's really noticeable and you really hear it working. But that's a cool little trick that I do quite a lot. And the thing that I like about that is it only happens, the processing is only happening when the vocal is in. So if you've got this cool synth part that's nice and buzzy and bright, but then it's slightly toned down when the vocal comes in, but in the gaps of the vocal, it rises up. Of course, in a musical way, you don't want it to be noticed. That can be a really nice effect. And for the energy of the music, I don't see how you can replicate that. I mean, you could with your own kind of automated EQ, but it's quite sophisticated. And when you watch the graph, it's ducking some high mids, it's ducking some low mids. When the singer gets louder, it's ducking even more. So it's very dynamic,
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it's like a dynamic sidechain EQ, or sidechain dynamic EQ or something like that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I used to do it before. I used to use FabFilter multiband compressor, and I would trigger certain instruments from the vocal to duck in the upper mid range, maybe a bit of the low mid range as well. And that kind of works. But like I said, I find the unmask module in the Neutron plugin, it's more sophisticated. You can do more with it. Seems to work with the way you want the vocal to sit a little bit better. Yeah,
Cool. I'll
really
definitely have to
cool.
check out that plugin for sure. I know I have it. I just never have looked at that feature before. So definitely cool to have that.
Yeah, no, it's really cool. And of course, the other thing is like panning as well. It's quite a simple thing, but often overlooked. You know, maybe just shifting the panning of one sound to the other side, panning things around, trying to create space, that kind of way.
Yeah. I love that you brought up panning. I think that is like such a underutilized tool. Like between just like volume and panning, those two are
Absolutely.
like the things that everyone forgets about. It's, you want to open up a new plugin because it looks fancy or something, but like those are some of the most important tools you have, and they can make your life so much better, so easy. Yeah.
when I used to first teach when I was first like teaching my mixing class at London School of Sound, that was the first lesson was, I want you to go home and mix this project. And it was very simple. It was like, 7 or 8 audio files or tracks. And people would come back and they would EQ the hell out of things, and completely change it. And then I said, well, hang on, let's pull up this song and let's just use volume and pan. And I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, that was a better mix than what the students had done. And that was my object lesson, was like, to think about those things first, panning, volume, before diving with an EQ, or like you say, spraying on the latest, newest plugin, really focus on those kind of things.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that came from my training in studios. Was there was kind of a mantra amongst recording engineers, was like, fix it in the recording, so whether that would be, change the settings on the guitar amp, or making sure you've got new strings on the guitar or new drum heads, make sure the acoustic space is set up right, try some different microphone placement, so get it nailed and dialed in as much as possible, so it's those kind of things before diving in the mixing process and using EQ. So I think I still kind of got that sensibility that rather than using EQ to help yourself out, maybe it's a balance thing, or panning.
Yeah, I definitely think those are like the first 2 places to look. You kind of have to have that hierarchy of like mental checklist of like how you're going to suss out a problem, and what you're going to do to it. And I think volume and panning are like the first 2 things you want to look at, just to see if you can make a big change there without having to get into all the plugins and compressors.
I think it can make, just panning, just things wider than the other guy, can make the mix sound more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, I quite often like to take mono sounds and pan it off to the side. The trick is to kind of make it feel still part of the mix, but hanging out there on one side over the other. And often in that kind of case, I might use, reverb pan to the other side, or a delay pan to the other side, even if subtle, just something to kind of join it back to the mix.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, you want your mix to feel balanced. You don't want it just to feel like you threw something on the other side just because you need it out of the way of something, right?
Yeah, definitely. But a lot of that came from, as well, I mean, sort of bonding together of the mix. Have you heard any of like, it's not particularly my kind of music, but John Coltrane's recordings from the 60s?
Yeah.
There's a song, is it called Crusade? I can't remember what album it's on. And he's the guy that he recorded, Rudy Van something or other. He was a kind of a strange guy, set up a studio in his parents' front room, and he had all these jazz legends come to record there. And I have to remember what it was. I can call up Spotify here. Anyway, so when you listen to that, and it's like mid-60s jazz recording, Crescent is the name of the album, John Coltrane. Like I say, not really my kind of style of music, but from an engineering point of view, it's incredible. And to see how they've panned things around. Okay, it was in the experimental times with stereo, where they had the drums and the bass on the right, and the horns were on the left, the piano's in the middle. But that said, the space that it has is just phenomenal. And I don't want to get too, I don't want to digress, but I've been listening to that in comparison to some modern music, and the modern music is smashed to hell and super squashed and hugely compressed. And when you listen to this John Coltrane song, Crescent, with loudness normalization on, it sounds louder than a lot of modern records. And even when you turn it off, it sounds somehow perceivably louder because of the dynamics, maybe the way things are panned. Yes, it's an object lesson that, we've gone forwards and developed things a lot, hugely. But those old recordings, when they were good, they were really good.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think it has to do with like the dynamics, the arrangements of the songs, the panning, and creating that contrast, right? Like, back then it wasn't about layering a million guitar tracks or whatever it was, right? It was like everyone had their part and the arrangements took care of themselves. Whereas now it's like everyone's double tracking everything, adding like a gazillion vocal layers and synth layers and all this, and there's like no contrast.
Yeah, one of my college tutors was like, used to tell us all the time, less is more, less microphones, less instruments. And it's actually one of the things as a producer that I try to do. I try to serve the song with as few instruments as possible and not just put things in for the sake of it. I fell into the trap when I first started producing music and programming my own things. I would think, okay, this doesn't really sound right to me. Let's add something else. No, it's still not right. I need to add something else. And I'll just keep on adding and adding. When I realized actually probably the foundation of what I have wasn't that good. And I should have probably just scrapped it and tried something else. So it's one of those things I have as a producer. I really want every single sound to have a justified reason for being there. So yeah, less is more can really help me out. And I remember the first time I observed an engineer using the Glyn Johns technique for recording drums. I mean, that's quite extreme, like 3 or 4 mics or whatever it is. But I was like, and for that particular track that they were working on, which was kind of a jazzy, soulful kind of thing, it just was perfect. And the drums just breathed so well. And there was kind of minimal, like phasing going on between the multi mics, and it just sounded glorious, not appropriate for every type of recording, of course. For a lot of metal, you're not going to get away with that without a direct mic crammed onto the snare, and a few samples layered in. But it was an eye opener, and it really broadened my palette, in terms of like recording techniques.
For sure. Yeah, I often try to remind myself sometimes when I look around my sessions and I see that I'm like getting pretty deep with plugins, I often try to remind myself, like, back in the day, people just had like volume, panning, compression. Or EQ and maybe compression on a board in front of them. They didn't have like everything else. So it was like you had what you had, and yet there were still people that were making amazing mixes. They only had three EQ points that they could touch per channel, that kind of thing. And so sometimes you just have to like really strip things down and like realize good mixes can be made.
I'm
that
as
way.
guilty as anyone about that. Sometimes when I'm mixing a lead vocal, and I step back and I go like, do I really need like 10 plugins? And in that situation, I usually duplicate the track and almost start again and just bring each plugin in and go, is this really adding something? Very similar to my production process. I'm like, does this sound really needed? A mix and lead vocal. Is this plugin really needed? Do I really need 2 compressors? Do I really need all this? Sometimes it is justified. Sometimes it really is. But I think it's good just to, without getting over analytical, just to question whether that's right.
For sure. Yeah. Well, speaking of vocals, that's another element of your mixes that I really enjoy. Like, I think you do a great job of getting your vocals to sound really clear and keep the focus of the listener the entire time, which I think is such an important thing. Like I find I listen to a lot of mixes and the vocals kind of just, they're there. They might be loud, but they blend in a lot with the background music. Whereas I feel like with your tracks, there's like this clarity and separation with the vocal that I really appreciate. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more about your vocal process and what kind of techniques you like to use there.
Yeah, well, where that came from was that working as an assistant engineer, it was very noticeable that the engineers who were not only good at mixing, but particularly good at mixing vocals, were the ones who were most in demand. Like really, and it's a real skill to mix vocals really well. So I learned from a lot of those guys, and it's just, I mean, I remember about 20 years ago, I realized I wasn't very good at mixing vocals. Didn't really know what compressors to use, didn't know what frequencies to boost, I didn't really know how to place it in the mix. So I really did a deep dive and really dug in and listened to stack loads of records. And a lot of the records in the early 2000s that you would listen to, like some of the Dr. Dre productions, Mary J. Blige, a lot of the R&B kind of stuff, their vocals were mixed so well. You know, super bright, super clear, nice effects, appropriate for the song. And I realized that would work in pop music really well. Pop at the time was maybe a bit overly wet, maybe not so upfront, you know, thinner, not as rich. So I really dug into that kind of thing, and I wanted to really up my vocal mixing game. And a lot of it was about having a select few tools rather than many, and knowing those tools really well and how they work. For example, one of the plugins that I used, and I still use at the time, was the Waves RVox, Renaissance Vox, and the Waves Renaissance Compressor. They have a certain kind of character that really works with vocals. They lock down the dynamic very well, and it keeps it the vocal locked in place, so it sits in a mix really well. So finding the compressors that worked either in hardware or as plugins that could get you a really nice sound quickly was very important. And some of those are the Waves Renaissance Compressor, the Waves RVox Compressor, the Waves CLA compressors are really, really good. Get used a lot here. The Fab Filter compressor is really good. I try not to get bogged down with too many options. I feel that if I can't get the sound that I want with those plugins that I mentioned, then there's probably something wrong with the vocal recording, and I probably need to start fixing it a bit more. But if I've got a really well recorded vocal, or even a good recording of a vocal, those plugins, those compressors really help as well. And, you know, not to go too deep, but I do a lot of kind of A/Bing of hardware compressors and plug-in compressors on vocals. And one of the things that I really like is when you don't necessarily, I mean, of course it depends on the style of music, but let's say you've got like a typical pop song. One of the things I like is when the compression really evens out every single syllable, and particularly like the Waves compressor plugins seem to be exceptional at that. It seemed to really marry well with the vocal, and it, like I say, it locks down the dynamic and it helps them become really clear. And it's very similar to what I learned as being a guitar player. I remember the first time I got a compressor guitar pedal, and I was scratching my head like, I know people use these things, but what the hell does it do, you know? And especially guitar pedals, because they don't have like gain reduction meters. So you're flying blind. You don't know what the hell is going on. There's no metering going on there. But one of the things that I noticed, even though I was probably setting it incorrectly as a teenager, was that it evened out my playing and made me sound like a better musician, you know? And that was for any style of like just jangly chords or even metal riffs, compressor before hitting the amp. So I kind of learned that then as a feel thing, that it can make the vocals seem like they've been performed better, you know, more consistent dynamic. So you've got all these attributes of locking down the vocal, making it sit at a certain point in the mix, musically sounding better. I think compression kind of makes them sound powerful. So, you know, to cut to the chase, like compression is a very large part of making vocals, you know, vocal mixing.
Of course.
And then I think it's also as well about dialing in the right kind of frequencies, where to put the high pass filter. Like I was saying, like late 90s, early 2000s, a lot of pop vocals are very thin sounding, but in the R&B world, they were a little bit thicker. They had a little bit more low mids and warmth to the sound. And since then, it's come across into the pop world. But yeah, so I tried to maybe have a little bit more low end in my vocals than someone else. I'm very conscious of where that filter's kind of sitting. Sometimes vocals need to be added or have some maybe 100 hertz dialed in to make them sound a little bit thicker. And then again, just dabbling all those frequencies in the mid range to make them sound like clear but not harsh. One of the things that I do a lot of is boosting like kind of very high frequencies, like 10, 11, 12 kilohertz. And again, it's one of those mantras that I kind of have, like I want it to be bright and airy and open, but not harsh. I find if you, especially in kind of pop kind of music or any kind of music, but if you boost too much 6, 7, 8K of vocals, they get very sibilant and it's not pleasant kind of sound. But you can do the same amount of boost, but even more at higher frequencies, and it creates this airiness kind of them. So yeah, I do a lot of juggling with EQ and compression, and I think more than half the battle, if not 3/4 of the battle, with mixing is getting the volume, the panning, EQ and compression, and everything else will just kind of fall into place. You put the tasteful reverbs and whatever have you. One of the things I do a fair amount with vocals is, even if they're dry, is use some subtle kind of maybe like delay, like a slapback delay, a ping pong delay, obviously, and just and being candid, a lot of times it's just auditioning maybe 4 or 5 different types of reverb to trying to get something that's really complementary. And it's largely dependent on what's going on with the music. Do I want the reverb to be noticeable? Do I want it just to make it feel like it's got some depth? It takes time.
Yeah, for sure.
It took me a long time and still, like, the whole sibilance thing as well is, it's not the most exciting topic, but I'm kind of obsessed with like techniques for controlling the sibilance and different de-essers and what have you.
Yeah. Well, I love that you brought up that idea of just using a little bit of a delay or like a little ping pong or slap or whatever. Personally, I prefer to use delay more than reverb generally when it comes to vocals. So I'm 100% on board with that. I think it largely depends on like the tempo of a song. Obviously, if it's like a slower song, you got more space to fill. So, sometimes reverb can fill that gap pretty nicely. And for a faster song, delay might do it, where you just get a quick instance of that vocal there for a split second and it's in and out, and sometimes that makes your mix sound a lot cleaner. But yeah, definitely a big fan of using delay with that. And I like what you mentioned too about like the top end and with like sibilance and, how if you do push too much of that, like 5, 6, 7K, then yeah, like that is where the S's really tend to be very present. So, sometimes just getting that air gets you that same effect as the vocal being brighter, but without all of that extra junk in there.
Yeah, and can I ask, have you found as well, it's quite amazing, like some singers just have savage sibilance.
Oh yeah.
S's are just crazy. Other people, not so much. And I've had this, like when I was working, I'm not going to name the girl band, but I did a lot of recording and mixing for a girl band that very well known in the UK. 3 girls, 2 of them had the perfect voice. You could almost use any mic. The third member, had the most sibilant voice, and you could not use the same mic or same settings. And it was just her voice. We used to try all different things, mic at a slight angle, pencil across the front of the mic, and just one of those things. It's just people's voices. So yeah, I think, and it probably is one of the hardest things, to really dial in sibilance. Like I say, I know it's not the sexiest topic, but I think if you're going to be, really good at vocal mixing, it's one of those things that you kind of additional things you need to be on top with, So, because you can, and I've had this before, where you can mix the first verse first two verses, first two choruses sounds perfect. You don't hear any lisping on the deesser. Gets to the bridge, and for whatever reason, there's a couple of lines that lispers like hell. So you've got to be really on your toes to listen through.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's like one of those things where it's like with vocals, we use pop filters to prevent like all those plosives from hitting the mic, but there's like no sibilance filter, So it's like the only sibilance filter is like really just finding the right mic and or the right angle.
If you could invent a mic that controlled sibilance and patent it, you would be
a mic that has a built-in de-esser.
Can you imagine?
That'd be best.
And just out of interest, you mentioned delays before. So what kind of delay plugins do you like?
I'm a big fan of just like the stock Pro Tools delay, like the mod delay or whatever. And for me, like my go-to is I usually just have like a stereo delay, like 110 millisecond delay on one side, 220 on the other, and like single repeat, and that's it, and like, and I'll usually roll off some of the top end. I find that that's just like all I need. And in isolation, it sounds weird as hell. But when it's in the mix, it feels like a reverb, but without it being a reverb, That's my go-to for pretty much 90% of the vocals I work on, I feel.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that because I've been around the world with different, I've had Roland Space Echoes, and I just adore delays. But I come back to the stock delays so many times. The Logic tape delay plugin, it just works.
Yeah.
The mod delay in Pro Tools, it just works. It goes to show you don't particularly need anything fancy. Obviously, if I'm trying to create like a special effect, a dubby kind of thing, then you need to get something specific. But yeah, and Waves H delay, I probably use that more than any other plugin.
That's a cool one too, for sure.
Every single mix.
Yeah, I find that when you're like just trying to get like when you're trying to get like a synced delay, the stock plugins are usually all you need. They're pretty bare bones, and they have everything you need. And then when you want that kind of like lo-fi sound, then like the H delay is great for that. It's got all that stuff built into it.
Yeah.
But then I agree. I think there's a lot of other plugins out there that just make everything really complicated. And
but I had the same experience in the guitar playing world. I had is it Boss DM3?
Or DD something?
DD3 or whatever it is. Yeah, I had one of those years ago, and I was like, oh, this is really cool, and love it. And obviously it blew my mind, the first time I had a delay pedal. But then, I kind of wanted to try something maybe more exotic, a bit more boutique, and I tried everything, perhaps not everything, but so many different delay pedals. And then I remember one time this guitar player came in and we were recording some guitars, doing a guitar solo, and he whipped out his Boss delay, and I was like, I haven't seen that for years. And being candid, I was a bit kind of like, okay. We tried that and a few of mine, and his just worked. Just sounded, my, original Memory Man's way too dark and noisy. And his Boss digital delay just had a certain kind of like, I don't think it's completely pure. I think it's got a little mojo going on. Maybe it's like a little bit of lo-fi-ness.
Yeah.
Very much reminds me of the Waves H delay. For some reason, one of these days, maybe I'll try and find out. It just works.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound too clean. It doesn't sound like too sterile. It has a little bit of something going on, even if you don't add any modulation. But yeah, it's really cool. And I think it's a really important thing for people to realize. I see it all the time. People ask me about, okay, I've just got Pro Tools or I've just got Logic. What plugins should I get next? What bundle? And I'm like, well, I think you should find out everything that you've got in the software first. I used to sit with the students all the time before they even knew what they had in Logic or Pro Tools. We're buying like Waves bundles and UAD bundles, and and oftentimes they didn't know what was in the stock plugins.
Totally, especially like the Logic stuff. I've always been super impressed by their stock plugins. I think that they're great. Like their reverbs are amazing. Their delays are great.
Like Space Designer. It's incredible.
That thing's killer. Yeah. Right on. Cool. Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I got one more question for you to wrap things up. At the end of the day, ultimately, what, in your opinion, makes a great mix?
Makes a great mix. Well, I think, first of all, you need to serve the song, and the mix needs to be appropriate for the song. And then I think it's just getting the foundations, the things that are important, right? Vocals, low end, drums, the way they hit, and then just creating some kind of excitement and emotion. One of the things that I really try to do is, it sounds a bit out there, but have some kind of emotion in my mixes, like energy, So yeah, I think there's some universal things. Clarity, sounds big, where appropriate. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It is a hard question to answer, and that's why I love to ask people. It kind of stops people sometimes. But I think you're right. I definitely think that there's like a lot of universal things that go into making a great mix, and I think you covered all of those there too. Yeah.
Yeah. There was was it Bobby Owenowski? He wrote the Mix Engineer's Handbook, and he had the 6 elements of a great mix, which was balance, frequency range, dynamics, depth, stereo width, and then I think he had special touches. Yeah,
that makes sense. I'm pretty sure I had him on. I had him on as a guest. I can't remember the episode number offhand, but I believe he talked about all that in that episode too. So that's a good episode for people to go back to as well. Yeah. Cool. Awesome, man. Well, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I really appreciate it. And we'll definitely have to continue this another time for sure.
Absolutely.
Right on, man. Thank you.
Part 2. Nice one. Thank you.
Talk soon.
Take care.
So that was my interview with Matt Foster, and I really enjoyed that. I loved that conversation all about, creating contrast in your mixes and how Matt likes to go about doing it with things like EQ and automating various compressor settings and, maybe making duplicates of other tracks and, processing the verses and the chorus is different and all that kind of stuff. I think that that's a really interesting thing. And it definitely makes your mixes sound more exciting because there's a lot more movement throughout the track. You don't just have a static mix, right? I think automation is such an important thing because it makes a mix go from sounding very flat, where you can tell like there's no volume differences, there's no processing changes, like none of that. It all kind of just sounds the same, right? I think a lot of people tend to mix songs like that, and they tend to sound amateur when you do that. But I love that Matt was talking about using automation in a lot of different ways to just create contrast and make your mixes sound more exciting. And I think that that's what really separates a lot of amateur mixes from pro mixes. So yeah, I really enjoyed talking about that. I thought it was really interesting to also learn more about his process when it comes to low end and how he likes to do things like side chaining with dynamic EQs. He talks about using that Neutron plugin there, but I think you could definitely do it without that Neutron plugin just by using some side chaining with a dynamic EQ. And yeah, also just getting to the idea of using volume and panning as like your primary tools for mixing. Again, I think that's such an important lesson that so many people lose sight of. It's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to use a sexy looking plugin or whatever, because it's fun to twiddle all the different knobs and, feel like you're using tools that you've seen other people use in videos and this and that. But at the end of the day, volume and panning are some of the most powerful tools, and I definitely don't want you to forget about those. So I love that Matt covered that in this interview. So yeah, I really enjoyed this episode. I hope you did too. And I had such a great time chatting with Matt that we actually have a couple really awesome announcements to make. So number one, you've probably heard me talk about my coaching program, Amplitude, before. Amplitude is a program where I work one-on-one with my students to help them complete their mixes and offer you feedback on your tracks as you're working through them. So if you're feeling stuck, you're not sure what to do, you can simply send your mix in and get personalized feedback on what to do specifically with your mixes. Well, Amplitude has been growing, and we've been getting some amazing results in that program. And because of that, I was looking to get some additional help, and Matt has actually come on as a new coach inside of that program too. So together, Matt and I are going to be helping out all of our students inside of that program and offering a lot more support and really helping people elevate their mixes. So really excited to have Matt on the MasterYourMix team and to be helping students inside of Amplitude. Now, if you're interested in learning more about Amplitude, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/Amplitude, and you can find all the details there. But just as a quick summary of the program, inside that program, you get personalized one-on-one feedback on your tracks. You get access to all of our MasterYourMix courses. You get access to mastering and a whole bunch more. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more about that program, make sure to visit masteryourmix.com/amplitude, and you can find all the details there. And the second fun announcement to make is that Matt and I have decided that we're actually going to be doing a free YouTube live coaching call. And anybody is invited to this. Now, this episode is scheduled to be released on December 6th. This YouTube live event that we're going to be doing is going to be on December 9th. So Saturday, December 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. And if you want to attend, all you need to do is visit the MasterYourMix YouTube page. The address for that is youtube.com/MasterYourMix. And on Saturday, December 9th at 1 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be hosting our live event. You just simply click on that video. And if you have questions, you want to engage with us, you want to get some feedback on stuff, definitely make sure to check that out and add your comments, and we'll address those all live on the call. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to this call with Matt on December 9th and working with him inside of our Amplitude program. And that is it for this episode. I can't wait to chat with you in the next one. We'll talk soon. Have a good one. Thanks for listening to the Master Your Mix podcast. To have your questions answered, submit your questions to questions@masteryourmix.com. Please go to iTunes and subscribe and leave a review. And for more information on how you can improve your mixes, visit masteryourmix.com.